Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, February 27th, 2014. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. This week, Paul the Toxicologist joins us for the third discussion on the toxicology of homebrew. Are there hidden dangers that we should be worried about in our homemade beers? If you're new to home brewing and would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. You can find me on Twitter. I'm Basic Brewing, all one word. Also on Facebook, I'm at facebook.com/basicbrewing.james. We have a show page on Facebook at facebook.com/basicbrewing. We're on the Google Plus too. And thanks again to everybody clicking on the Amazon.com associate link on our basicbrewing.com site. You know how it works. Whenever you think of Amazon, think of us first and click on our website, basicbrewing.com. Find our Amazon ad. Click on that. It'll take you to Amazon. Then whatever you shop, whatever you buy, we will get a chunk of that, and it won't cost you any extra, and we greatly appreciate everybody who does that. We also have associate links for Brew Your Own magazine and the American Homebrewers Association on our site. You can find our Basic Brewing iPhone app on iTunes, our Android app on Amazon.com. We're on the BlackBerry podcast directory, and we're on the Stitcher app as well. Windows Phone directory, all kinds of different places and things. Check out our brewer's logbook at basicbrewingshop.com. In the front is a blank calendar that you can use to track your fermentations and plan your brews. There's room in the back to log the details of up to 50 batches of brew. If you want to put a tip in our tip jar, some coinage in our guitar case, you can go to basicbrewing.com/support. Thanks to everybody who has done so already. And if you do, I'll send you a link to our bonus episode from last year. Protect your precious beer with one of our growler bags. Check those out at basicbrewingshop.com. I'm currently editing an episode of Basic Brewing Video that should be out by Friday of this week. In this episode, Steve and I address the assumption that I hear a lot, that it takes just as long to brew a 6-pack small batch as it takes to brew 2 cases of beer. Or it takes just as long to brew a small batch of beer than it does to brew a full-size batch of beer. So, just how fast can we brew a tasty 6-pack IPA? Tune in and see. I think you will be pleasantly surprised. We saw some snowflakes this morning here in northwest Arkansas, and it reminded me of the question about cold temperatures affecting fermenting beer that we got a couple weeks ago from the homebrewer in Atlanta, who was worried about his power going out for his freezer. I got another response from a cold region. This one comes from Peter in Canada, who writes, I can go a bit further than the guy you mentioned about in the last show. Due to an electrical issue, the heat went off in my outdoor fermenting fridge. Halfway through the fermentation, my German pills froze solid. And Peter included a photo of a carboy that was obviously frozen with frozen foam coming out of the top and cascading down the side of the carboy. Peter says, that picture was taken after I brought it into the house. After defrosting and warming up a bit, it continued fermenting. No off tastes, and a Pils is a beer that they would be noticed in. Not only did it continue fermenting, I harvested the yeast and then used it in a second Pils that tasted just as good. Very cool. Literally, I guess. Very cool. Thanks, Peter, for that. Toxicologist Paul and I have a lot to talk about, so let's get right into it. This is our third conversation about the toxicology of homebrewing, so if you haven't heard the first two, it might be handy to go back and listen to them. You don't need to do it before you listen to this, but it's good information in addition to what you hear today. Very useful stuff, not only in thinking about brewing, but thinking about a lot of information that we see on the internet all the time. Toxicologist Paul, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Hey, James. Thanks for having me back again. You're
back for the third time.
I guess there's a lot of toxicology questions out there, and glad we can answer them.
Homebrewing's really dangerous.
I don't know. I think this one will be no exception to that. I think we'll find out that homebrewing is not very dangerous, and hopefully we can help people relax and have a homebrew.
So to summarize the first two parts, we covered tons and tons of stuff. And basically, I think the two things that we've discovered that really are dangerous are hops for dogs. Keep the hops away from your dogs, and the alcohol that we're producing. So
I think that's a pretty fair summary, James. And I think one of the examples I think we're going to talk about today, we'll talk about that maybe even a little bit more detail. But yeah, I think hopefully we're going to be able to provide a little bit of perspective for people in terms of what should they really be worried about when they're homebrewing.
Okay, so let's jump right in there. Trash can liners. Now, I went up to a brew on premise place up in St. Paul, and they had big buckets or kind of trash canny kind of things that they ferment in, and they had plastic bags to line those fermenters. And I thought that's a brilliant idea, but trash can liners, was it a specific kind of trash can liner that was the question? I lose track of all these things.
Yeah, we got a question from one of the listeners about the exact same thing that you were talking about at the Brewmont premise. Is he was using what he had found were food grade, FDA compliant trash can liners, and he was doing the same thing, throwing them into a bucket to cut down on cleanup, which I agree. It sounded like a really interesting idea to me too. It's been a while since I've used buckets, and it's a lot harder to sneak that trash can liner down inside of a glass carboy. But I think if you were using buckets, this is a really interesting idea in terms of cutting down on cleanup. So his question was really about whether FDA compliant, whether he had to worry about anything using those FDA compliant trash can liners. And this is another one that I think it's one of the reoccurring themes that we've had from the two previous podcasts, that if you're using something that's food grade, you're really, especially these plastics, that there's really not very toxic things in them. And if you're using something that's food grade, you really shouldn't have to worry about them, even if you're using it for an application that's slightly outside the scope of what it was truly intended for. So my job has to do with regulatory affairs. I'm in the regulatory affairs group. So one of the things I do is spend a lot of time reading regulations. So when he told me that his trash bags were FDA compliant, I had to go all technical on him and talk about what does FDA compliant really mean? And does that really mean food grade? And, the thing about the regulations is that regulation, it can say that it's food grade, and that it can be one of the regulations it's meeting. And that is, in fact, the one that he did actually find the reference, and we found that it was FDA compliant, meaning it was a food grade liner. But one of the other things that's very specific in the regulations is that it will define what applications it is actually approved for. So more so than it being food grade is it food grade and approved for the very specific application you're using it for? And in the case with the trash can liners, these FDA compliant liners, we did find the reference to the U.S. regulation that said it was food grade. And it said the plastics are used for packaging, transporting, or holding food, excluding alcoholic beverages, at temperatures not to exceed 250 degrees. Yeah, so it is a food grade liner. It's FDA compliant, but in the regulation, it's very specific that is not for alcoholic beverages. Now, that does not mean that it is not safe for alcoholic beverages. It just means that the testing that they've done did not include testing for alcoholic beverages.
Now, why would that make a difference? Is alcohol a solvent? Is that what they're worried about?
Alcohol is a solvent, and it will definitely extract things out that are different than what an aqueous environment would extract out. And the way that a company would certify that these trash can liners are food grade for some applications and not others is you actually use the industry term is a simulant. So if you have a beverage like a milk, there's a specific simulant that you use, and it's a certain percentage of water and a certain percentage of other things, and you see what leaches out. If you're using the liners for alcoholic beverages, it would be a different simulant that you would have to use to confirm that your trash can liner is also approved for that use. Well, since this company may not want to use it for holding alcoholic beverages, they may have just not done that testing with that second simulant. Therefore, they know it's okay for things like water or other aqueous beverages. They don't have the data to suggest one way or another whether it's okay to use with alcoholic beverages because they never intend to use it for that application.
So there's no data on that.
Exactly. So there's likely an absence of data on that. And I think, and going back to when I was talking to my friend who's a polymer toxicologist, you're talking about polyethylene. It's the components, the starting materials that are used for polyethylene are really safe. They have very low toxicity. Anything that's likely to leach out of polyethylene, they're these very small components or the monomers that are used in the production of the polyethylene. They're likely to migrate out under conditions that are approved for use, just as well as they would under applications that would include alcoholic beverages. So you're likely to migrate out the same things under the approved use as the unapproved use. Therefore, you really probably don't have to worry about anything, even if you're using it to line it during fermentation. I would call this a very low risk for toxicity.
So your gut feel is that it's okay?
Yeah, my gut feel is that it's okay. I think this is a very low risk situation.
And I thought about that. When I saw that at the brew on premise place, I thought that's just genius. And then I forgot about it. So I know that there are places out there who, like Uline, I'm sure sells plastic bags and such as that. And I guess if I called that place, they would tell me what bags they use and where they got them. So I just don't use buckets. I just like watching my beer ferment. So, but it would be a great idea to, you wouldn't have to sanitize them. You wouldn't think.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so. Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's a great idea. I think, going back to, again, some of the recurring themes here, I would, do your diligence and try to find a food grade liner. Look for a clear liner. Don't buy a blue plastic bag or a red one. Don't buy a scented one or some of these other things that you can get in terms of plastic bags, but stick to a food grade liner. And my personal opinion is that you really would have no risk of anything happening if you're using that.
Yeah, those scented, what is it, the Febreze scented trash can liners.
Exactly.
They go right up my nose.
Yep, me too.
Firm Cap S. I suggested this, and then somebody else wrote in and suggested it as well. I posted on Twitter one time. Somebody asked a question about they had a blow off, and I use Firm Cap S, and especially if I'm making a wheat beer, I put a couple of drops in the brew kettle, and I might put a couple of drops in the fermenter as well, and that really helps. It's a surfactant that knocks down the bubbles. But I got blowback from that. Somebody said, "Oh, don't use Firm Cap S; it's toxic." And I said, "Well, I only used like 2 drops in 5 gallons." So, what did you find out about Firm Cap S?
This is another one that has a recurring theme. I think one of the first 2 we did. Another one of the clarifying agents. I can't remember which one it was, but this is actually getting back to the regulatory aspect. The clarifying agent that we found is very PVPP. That one is very similar to this, where if you look at the regulation, it says if you're going to use it in the production of beverages, alcoholic beverages, you need to filter it out before you sell that alcohol or beverage commercially. So the regulation does indicate that you want to filter these things out beforehand. So again, that's the regulation, and that's what the regulation says. And there's likely a reason behind that regulation. But if you look at what Firm Cap S is, so it's dimethyl polysiloxane. When I looked at the toxicology associated with it, it's a very non-toxic substance again. So very similar to the PVPP clarifying agent. The toxicity of firm cap S is remarkably low. They have done all sorts of tests on it with animals, and they have data for humans. So JECFA is one of the organizations that we've talked about in the past. It's an internationally recognized scientific body that reviews toxicology data. And they have set an allowable limit of 1.5 milligrams per kilogram per day for consumption of polydimethylsiloxane. And that's really the safe level. So they're saying 1.5 mg per kg per day is a perfectly safe level. And again, that's with uncertainty factors built on top of that. And they actually fed this to rats, and at 150 mg per kg over 2 years, they didn't have any bad effects. So really, I mean, this is a very non-toxic compound. Using that calculation of 1.5 mg per kg per day and trying to figure out what that would mean in terms of your 2 drops per batch, the calculation actually we found online was that 2 drops would be about 25 mg per liter of the polydimethylsiloxane. If you're drinking 2 beers per day, so about 700 milliliters of beer per day, that would result in consumption of about 17.5 milligrams of dimethyl polysiloxane per day. JECFA set that safe level of 1.5 mg per kg per day. So for a 70 kilogram adult, that's about 105 milligrams of it per day is really, perfectly safe, almost no risk at all of having adverse effects. So 105 mg per day for a 70 kilogram adult, and we said that 17.5 milligrams is what you could get at the very highest amount of possible exposure using firm cap S as indicated. So you're sixfold below what the safe level would be. So that's actually also that's not considering the possibility that dimethyl polysiloxane may actually settle out during fermentation. And quite a bit of it is probably lost in that yeast cake. So even that exposure estimate is probably a gross overestimate of the exposure you're getting. So I would not worry about using firm cap S.
Well, good, because it's handy.
It's not something I've used before, but every time I make a starter, I think, oh, you know what? It would really be nice if I didn't have to sit here and babysit this the entire time. So maybe I have to start looking into that.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I use. I use maybe a drop when I'm making a starter. It not only helps in the boil, but also in the, if you've got it on a stir plate, once the fermentation starts to kick off, boy, the bubbles start to come up. And sometimes if you don't have something in there to counteract that, you're going to have a mess on your hands. So good. There you go. Leaded glass in carboys. Do they still put lead in glass?
The answer to that is yes, they do still put lead in glass. And this came as a question. Actually, John Palmer had forwarded this to me from someone who had emailed him. He got an email from someone who said they had bought a whole bunch of glass carboys. And this individual had gotten nervous when he looked at the bottom of those carboys and it said, Hencho en Mexico, so made in Mexico. And he was concerned that leaded glass could be a possibility, that, leaded glass, there is such a thing as leaded glass. So would we have to worry about the source of these carboys before fermenting in them? And, leaded glass is a thing, but the good news is that leaded glass is a very specific purpose, and it's really fine crystal is where leaded glass comes in. Leaded glass, adding anything to glass, it would just add cost. You wouldn't add lead to glass unless you wanted to make it very beautiful. If you are going to be fermenting in your crystal decanter, I think you may want to rethink that. So your fine crystal decanter may actually be leaded glass. And I wouldn't ferment in that, but you'd need a lot of crystal decanters, I think, to ferment a 5-gallon batch. Probably not very realistic. And this was good news for me because I went down and checked on all my glass carboys, and all my carboys also said made in Mexico. So I felt a little more comfortable after reading a little bit more about leaded glass.
Yeah, so I'll have to throw away my 6-gallon fine leaded crystal carboys.
Your Swarovski crystal giant goblet that you got for your wedding. Yeah, don't ferment in that. Or if you're going to, then put a trash can liner in it.
There you go. It's getting it back out. That's the hard part.
Yeah, exactly.
Urea and ethyl carbamate. Now I know that urea is used as a yeast nutrient. Is ethyl carbamate is that also a nutrient?
Ethyl carbamate is not a nutrient, but we had one of the listeners write in an email that said he had read that ethanol will react with urea to become ethyl carbamate.
Oh.
And ethyl carbamate that's a bad compound. That's a nasty compound. So his concern was really he was adding yeast nutrient. He was concerned that the yeast nutrient would react with the ethanol, so the urea in the yeast nutrient would react with the ethanol and become ethyl carbamate in beer. So this is one that I researched a little bit more, and so ethyl carbamate, that is definitely a reaction that happens. So urea with ethanol does become ethyl carbonate. But I did find a reference for beer. And so certainly urea is a yeast nutrient that's added in the beer industry. It's a common yeast nutrient. The good news is that when they surveyed beers, they did not find any beers that had significant levels of ethyl carbamate in it. So what's really likely to happen is that the yeast really take up that urea very quickly, and because it's a building block for a lot of the things that the yeast need to live, things like proteins, they take that urea up very rapidly and integrate it into the things that they need to live and reproduce. So there's probably, by the time you have ethanol around, there's likely very little, if no, urea around. So you're not getting that production of ethyl carbamate in beer. And, when I looked at this too, it had the paper that I found it in actually had a really nice comparison of the toxicity that would come from a whole bunch of different things that you could find in beer. And it compared the amount you would be exposed to versus the levels that you would think would have an adverse effect. And it really drove home this point that ethanol really is the compound in beer that has the highest risk. They had so what they did is they did something that's called the margin of exposure. So margin of exposure, or MOE, compares the amount that you're exposed to with the amount that's known to have the adverse effect. So the bigger that margin is, the safer something would be. And these are all for things that have, you can define what an adverse effect level would be. And when they compared the margin of exposure for a number of different things in beer, the margin for ethanol was threefold. So there was only a factor of 3 in between the safe level of ethanol. No, there's a factor of 3 in between the adverse level of where adverse effects can happen with ethanol exposure and the amount of ethanol in beer. The next closest thing was lead, and that was at 132-fold in between the amount of lead that could be possibly present in beer and the amount that has been shown to have adverse effects. So ethanol is almost 10 times more. There's 10 times more risk from ethanol than the other compounds that they were looking at in beer. And so you can really see that, if you're talking about the risk from beer consumption, it's really, even on the homebrew scale, you're really talking about ethanol as your largest risk.
Right. Ethel Carbamate is my favorite Broadway singer. She could really belt out a tune. I have to say that on Steve's behalf. If he was here, he would have already said that.
I'm not familiar with their work, but I must not be as cultured as you are, Dane.
Now, this is the next one is a fun one. It brings me back to summers growing up in Central Arkansas, drinking hot water coming out of a garden hose, and you got to be really thirsty to find that refreshing drinking out of a hot garden hose. So, what was the question about using a garden hose in brewing?
Yeah, one of the listeners sent in a message asking about he was using a garden hose to fill up his brew kettle. So he had a system where he had a very remote brew kettle. I don't remember the details of why he was hundreds of feet away from his water source, but
Probably because he was 100 feet away from his wife. If you're going to do that, you do that out there in the yard. Okay, yes, dear.
very likely the case. So he was concerned that so he was looking for the low cost alternative, and he wanted to run his water line, and he didn't want to invest the money on the food grade hoses. So those white hoses that you can use for potable water for your RV, or they do sell water food grade, and you could call it food grade hoses at your local hardware store that really are for the transportation of water. But he was using garden hoses, and he had heard again through the internet that using a garden hose, you should not drink that water because that water is really not safe. And so I did a little bit of research on this, and I found one of the articles that I think probably a lot of the internet points back to. I'm not going to dignify the organization that has put out that with referring to them, but I'm sure your listeners can find it if they want. It sounds very disparaging, but actually, I think they actually ran a good study. I think the problem is they really misinterpreted the information that came out of it. So they said that they've looked at the amounts of some of these compounds in garden hoses. And really, if you think about a garden hose, you don't really care what's in the garden hose. Really, you only care about what's going to be leaching out of the garden hose. So and this is the concept that we brought up with John Palmer and the brass, there could be lead in that brass, but you only care if that lead is going to be coming out. If that lead is covalently bound to everything that's in your brass fitting, and there's an oxide layer on the top that's preventing it from leaching out, really, you don't care about it because that lead is never going to be in your beer. The same is true for the hoses. If you're looking at the total amount of these plasticizers present and you are dissolving the garden hose to figure that out, that's not really relevant to the exposure you're going to get from your homebrew system. Really, what you care about is the migration of those compounds from the hose into your water. And actually, this website had conducted that study as well. They conducted a study where they took garden hoses and they had water in them, and then they looked for compounds in them like lead and some of these plasticizers. The issue is the experimental design that they used was to leave the garden hose in the sun for 48 hours filled with water, and then they looked at the water that was in that garden hose. And things like heat are going to increase the migration of compounds into the water. And they found some things at what I would consider pretty trace levels that I would not be concerned about. But the other thing is it's not representative of how people are going to be using these garden hoses. And like you said, growing up in Arkansas, drinking out of the warm hose, you could tell that there was these plasticizers floating around. You could tell it just by tasting it, by smelling it. And the advice we gave back to the listener was, if this is how you're going to be using your garden hose, think about running off the first set of water out of that hose, and don't put that in your brew kettle immediately. And that was actually consistent with how the listener was actually using that. He wasn't just running that stagnant water from the hose into his brew kettle. And I think if you avoid doing that, the chances that any of these things are going to be measurable in water that's free flowing through the hose is really low. I think if you really want to be conservative and you want to be safe as you possibly could be, again, always use food grade materials when available. But for this one, I think you're probably talking about a really low risk, especially if you're doing a QC on your brew water, which you really should be doing. Hopefully he's not, running that hose water in and it smells like plastic. I think you're going to be able to tell that. You'll be able to tell that there's an issue with that water even without testing it.
Could he get one of those? We've got a camper, and we have the white hose, but we also have a big carbon filter that you stick on the end of the hose before before it goes into the camper. That would certainly help with at least the taste of the water, and it might take out the chlorine as well. That's one thing that if he's getting brewing water straight from a hose, I'd be more worried about the chlorine off flavors in his beer than anything else.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point, James. And that reminds me, he did say that in one of the follow-up emails. He said he did, in fact, have a carbon filter at the end of his hoses. So exactly, like if he's got that carbon filter at the end, if he's running off the first bunch of water, not into his brew kettle, that carbon filter is going to catch a lot of these things too. So you're really talking about a pretty low risk here. And I told him to focus on other things before really worrying about replacing those hoses.
Well, there you go. Our old friend, the copper wort chiller.
Yeah, the copper wort chiller. This was a question that we got from one of your listeners who said he had a professor of cellular biology who had studied copper for decades and the effect that copper was having on neurons. And he had told everyone to be really careful about using copper in his brew house. So I guess my initial impression with this one is, copper has been in the brewing industry for a long time. I grew up in Wisconsin, and one of the brew tours that I've had is the New Glarus Brewery, and they have beautiful copper kettles, at least in the old brewery. I think they've now switched to stainless steel. But even New Glarus had copper kettles up until really recently. So copper has really been a part of the brewing industry for hundreds of years.
In fact, I think in some instances, isn't the brew kettle itself referred to as a copper?
Yeah, I think you're right, James. I definitely think you're right. And so copper is one of those things. It's an essential yeast nutrient as well. And in fact, it's an essential nutrient for humans. You need copper. If you have a copper deficiency, you actually will end up having a symptoms of a deficiency. That's unhealthy to not have enough copper. Not that I think you're getting very much copper from your beer, but the yeast are going to pull a lot of that into. The amount of copper that's going to be coming off of your wort chiller, it's probably almost all going to get absorbed up by those yeast because, again, they need it to live. They incorporate it into the enzymes that they're using to conduct your fermentation. So that copper, it's going to get absorbed. The first toxicity you see with copper is gastrointestinal. You get bad things happening to your GI tract if you get too much copper. In the absence of seeing those gastrointestinal effects, I don't think it's very likely that you're going to get these neuronal effects. Copper, I really wouldn't worry about copper in the brew system.
Now, I take my immersion chiller, and after I chill my wort, I take out the copper coil, and I wash it in dishwater, with Dawn dish soap. Am I doing a good thing or a bad thing or a neutral thing?
That's a good question. I'm not sure about the dish soap. I think it comes down to the color of it, if I remember correctly. And I think John Palmer in How to Brew has a good description of how you would really want to clean your copper if you want to make sure that you're, A, taking care of your equipment, and B, making sure that as little of that copper is leaching out into your brew kettle as possible. Looking at it real quick, he says, keep an eye on your copper wort chiller, and if it becomes black, then it should be cleaned with solutions like vinegar or Revere copper or stainless steel cleaner. Mm. So I think if you really want to keep your copper at its finest, then John Palmer, I'm definitely deferring to him in his metallurgy background. I would trust John Palmer to know what you should be doing with your brew kettle and if you have a copper brew kettle, that would be really awesome. But your copper wort chiller, probably more likely.
Yeah, my copper brew kettle's sitting right next to my lead crystal carboy. No, I've had my wort chiller for 17 years, maybe 18 years, and it looks brand new. Or it looks, the part that's been in the beer looks pretty much brand new, and the parts that are sticking out, don't look that much darker than the part that is actually immersed. So
Yeah, that sounds like mine too, James. Yeah, you can definitely tell where the fill line is on my brew kettle by exactly where it is on the wort chiller.
Right. Vinyl tubing. Can you? May not be the question that you're answering, but can you just go to the hardware store and get the vinyl tubing that they've got for sale there by the foot?
So vinyl tubing it's another thing that I know they sell food grade vinyl tubing. And if you want to be cautious, you can find food grade vinyl tubing. Homebrew stores will sell it. I'm sure you can find it on the online retailers. This is another example where I think food grade tubing, especially with the applications you're talking about using it, the stuff that you're getting from the hardware store, as long as it's not colored, I'd definitely stick to the clear tubing as opposed to colored tubing of any sort. You're probably talking about something that you're not increasing your risk very much. I guess one thing to really keep an eye on is making sure you get something rated to the temperatures you're using it at. If you're going to be using this for racking, finished beer, or something that's on the cold side, I think I'd probably worry very little about leaching anything out of that vinyl tubing into your beer. If you're talking about transferring hot wort, I would probably take a look at it and make sure that it's rated for that temperature. That probably you don't want to leach things in, but you also don't want your tubing to dissolve in front of you.
Yeah.
And I know looking at tubing online at the homebrew suppliers, a lot of them will indicate what kind of temperature they're rated up to. But in terms of vinyl tubing, I think if you want to be conservative, make sure you're getting that food grade vinyl tubing. But if you're in a pinch or looking to cut a couple corners, I would call that pretty low risk of using vinyl tubing out of your local home supply, your local hardware store.
Now here's a I'm going to throw you a curveball here, Paul. Let's see how you handle it.
All right.
I had a conversation with a couple of fine brewers in Iceland, and they use electric brewing systems, and they do brew in a bag, and they actually mash and boil in plastic buckets. They put a heating element in the bottom of the plastic bucket, and they heat their strike water in there, and they mash with the bag, and then they take the bag out, and they actually just bring the water up to the boil in those plastic buckets.
So like you're talking about like those white food grade buckets?
I think so.
Or just, even any bucket. I'm surprised that those buckets hold up to that kind of temperature, James.
Me too.
I guess again, if they're using food grade buckets, I would probably not worry too much about that. I think if you were leaching out, you're likely to leach out anything you would at cold temperatures as you would at warm temperatures. Boiling water, you're starting to get up to the point where, okay, well, are you going to start leaching out something else? But I think if you were really leaching out anything different, you'd realize that by looking at your bucket. Your buckets would probably dissolve if you were really leaching something crazy out of it. And that bucket, that plastic, those are all polymers. That's more or less everything that's left in that plastic is these long polymers that are exceptionally non-toxic because your body just will not absorb them. They go right through you. And anything that's left over, starting materials, the monomers, the antioxidants, all that stuff is really water soluble and it's going to leach out right away. Even if you're doing cold water, even ice cold water, it's probably going to leach a lot of those starting materials out. So again, there's not really a difference between what you get under what we're going to call intended use of the bucket and probably, honestly, even boiling things in that bucket.
Lead in pipes and water heater buildup.
Yeah, so this is kind of a continuation of some of the emails and some of the questions that we had in the last one too. I had read somewhere online that you want to be careful about the lead that's in your pipes, and if you're especially if you live in an old part of town that you really want to, you may want to even do some testing of that water to see if you have a concern from lead in the pipes. And we got an email from Scott. I can't remember Scott's last name, but one
Was
of
it
your
was it Scott Coué from
it is. It's Scott Coué. That's it.
Detroit?
Yep.
He's our coffee roasting guy. He's been on the show before.
Oh, that's right. Another hobby that I don't think I'm going to be undertaking anytime soon. I think that's something I'd have to be 100 feet away from the house before I was able to do from what I've heard about these smoke levels.
Well, you just put the thing outside.
That's true.
Don't do it inside.
No, every now and then I think I need a new hobby, and it's on the short list. So getting back to the question, so Scott Coué has said that he's actually done a little bit of homework too, in that he's actually suggesting that there's an oxide layer that builds up on those lead pipes, and that oxide layer is going to prevent lead from leaching into your water. So again, maybe I was overstating from the last time. Here I am, the toxicologist. I'm trying to provide pragmatic advice to people in terms of what they need to worry about, and I may have been too conservative in that one. I guess if you wanted to be conservative still, you may want to still test. I think the advice from or the details from Scott is just suggesting that you may not find anything, that the risk of you actually finding levels that are of concern may be pretty low.
Yeah, but if I were to live in an older house, just for my own peace of mind, I think that I would like to have a test done by a reputable either testing company or a reputable testing kit. Just again, and since I've got kids, especially, but just for my own peace of mind, it wouldn't hurt.
It certainly wouldn't hurt, and I think that's good advice too, James. If lead's something that it's definitely one of those kind of ugly compounds, and even though it is inherent in the environment, and there's really no way you can limit your lead exposure to none. So it's one of those things that it probably does make sense that, especially if you're living in an older house or apartment, you may want to look into it.
Go ahead.
No, I guess then on the other hand, the water heater contribution, I guess I'm not as familiar with this one, and I did try to find some information, and the information that we got was that what could end up happening is you could get this collection of, it sounds like a sludge at the bottom of your water heater that ends up with sediment getting into your tap water. But it sounds like it's things like iron and calcium that could end up in your beer. And these are not necessarily things you want to drink high concentrations of. Calcium really probably not that much of a concern, but iron is something that actually leads to more poisoning of children through accidental consumption than a lot of things, actually. Dietary supplements or vitamin pills with iron, it doesn't take that much iron for at least children to reach a toxic level. But, I was reading also about the limited detections from sensory standpoint, and the amount of iron that you need to have toxicity. I think you'd probably notice that if that was in your beer. And I guess I didn't do as much homework around this one as maybe I could have. I'm not sure if this is that big of a concern. I think another mitigation factor that you could put in there is, if you really want to be careful, run that hot water for a while, run off a gallon of water from the hot water prior to using it. And you're probably likely to get rid of, anything that's in that system, or, any kind of sediment that's floating around.
Okay, I've got another. That's the end of our official list, but I've got another curveball here for you. It's not beer related, but it's toxicology related. Have you been following the Subway sandwich bread ingredient controversy?
I haven't been following it, but I had had one of my toxicology friends post what I thought was a pretty funny take on it. So even though I haven't been following it, I have heard about it. So, okay, let's see. Reading a little bit real quickly, they found a compound in the Subway bread, something called azodicarbonamide, that is also used in the production of yoga mats. So,
So it's healthy, right?
sure, it's healthy. So that was the comment from my toxicologist friend on Facebook was everyone's freaking out that Subway is putting things in their bread that is in yoga mats. And her comment was, well, doesn't it just mean that you can eat your yoga mat now? These things are completely safe. So go ahead and eat your yoga mat if you're done with your yoga session, just and hungry for a snack, just take a couple bites because it's not going to hurt you.
But is this another thing about? I mean, again, it's probably unfairly putting you on the spot, but do you think that this is another one of those things where that's gotten blown out of proportion by people knowing half of the information that they should know and having a knee-jerk reaction to something?
Yeah, I would say that's definitely the case. And I think it's one of the things that I struggle with in terms of trying to communicate. Scientists, my people are not a very communicative people, and we often have trouble getting our point across to people who are not scientists. And as a toxicologist, the easiest concept for people to get is that too much of anything is bad. So everyone knows that you can drink too much water and it'll kill you, or too much anything, vitamin C and vitamin A, too much of it is bad for you. So they understand that, and people often look at the dose response curve as a line. It's a linear process that starts at zero amount of exposure means no risk whatsoever, and then you have a straight line that goes up from that axis. And that's really how you determine a dose response. But that's in fact not the case, because really when you're talking about toxicity, the line that shows toxicity, if you're again looking at it on the XY axis, you start at zero exposure is zero risk, but it's actually more of a ski slope where you walk along the bottom and then you get a sharp incline and then it levels off again at the top. It's called a sigmoidal curve, so it kind of looks like an S or a ski slope, starting at low on the bottom at the zero and going up, and then leveling off at the top. The issue is that people don't understand the bottom half of that dose response curve. And the bottom half really says that there's a limit, there's a threshold for nearly all toxins that below that threshold, you aren't getting any safer by reducing your risk or by reducing your exposure. So if you have something like azocarbonamide, you could have a safe level of, whatever it is, 1 milligram per day would cause nobody to have an adverse effect. So does that mean you really want to have less than 1 milligram per day? So does that mean that having half a milligram per day is safer? It doesn't mean that, because a milligram per day, nobody's going to have an adverse effect. By having half a milligram per day, still nobody has an adverse effect. So it's not any safer at that level. And, the other way that I've tried to think about this is there's some medications that you take where you're going to take 2 tablets a day. You have to take your allergy medication. And, you have to take 2 tablets a day. So 2 tablets a day, that's what they're telling you to take because they know that that is a safe level of that medication. Medications that, if you take too much of that medication, you're going to have an adverse effect. If we gave 100 people 200 tablets of your allergy medication, those 200 people or those 100 people that took 200 tablets would all have an adverse effect. Mm-hmm. At 2, nobody's going to have an adverse effect. So does that mean you should really take 1? Because, if 2 is safe, well, then 1's really safer. It actually doesn't mean that. It means that 2 is safe. Even going down to 1, you're not going to have a reduction in the amount of people who have an adverse effect. You're at the bottom of that dose response curve where, the bottom of the sigmoid where you're below the threshold where people are having adverse effects.
It's an interesting way to think about it. So I guess we did. It wasn't completely a bunny trail to talk about the Subway sandwich bread ingredient, but I guess the real question is, if it doesn't hurt the product, it doesn't hurt not to have it in there. I guess if it doesn't hurt the product not to have it in there, then it's not hurting anybody to take it out.
No, that's also true. I mean, taking it out certainly isn't going to hurt anyone. For the most part, I think there are situations, and one of the things that we do try to think about in terms of toxicology and food toxicology is, especially if you're talking about preservatives. So, you have some preservatives in a food. If you take those preservatives out, what may end up happening is you could lose the nutrients that are there. So if you have a preservative in there that's going to preserve the amount of, I don't know, vitamin C or, vitamin D, something that's there, well, okay, I don't want any preservatives in there, so let's take them out. Well, then you may actually have an adverse impact on your food. It may not be delivering as much nutrition as it used to because you took these preservatives out of it. So you can actually have, in some cases, it's certainly not all of them, and I'm not sure about this Subway sandwich example, but in some cases, by removing things, you may actually be reducing the nutritive value of those foods.
Well, if I could get on my soapbox for just a second, I think there's kind of a disturbing trend out there where fear and rumor are topping science as far as better criteria or more valued criteria for making decisions, and that kind of makes me nervous. But that's just my soapbox.
Yep. Well, I totally agree, James. It's definitely we've tried to steer away from some particular topics over the course of these last 3 podcasts, and I'll save those for my Subway sandwich podcast that I always do. But really, it's one of we've avoided some topics because they're hot button topics that people get a little bit of information and it's not the whole picture. And science is not about a single data point. Science is about weighing all of the evidence that you have available and drawing a conclusion from all of the evidence. And I agree that it does seem like sometimes when you're eating yoga mats in your Subway sandwich, that people have a tendency to react to that. And, maybe rightly so, but there's definitely situations where people just react to it because, they have only a limited amount of that information. And if they would look holistically, that they probably would come to a different conclusion.
Well, Paul, I appreciate your shedding some light, some scientific light with real information. And it's also good to hear you questioning yourself, because, like on the water heater and the lead pipe issue, because that's what science is all about too. It's always looking for new data and questioning your viewpoints and your results, and then modifying them if you need to.
That's right. And no, it's been a lot of fun the last 3 episodes, James, and hopefully we can collect a few more questions and maybe do it again. But we got a lot of good information from the listeners too. We had a lot of people call in, or maybe not call in. Is this a call-in show now, James?
No.
We had a lot of people write in with good data, information, things that they could point to. I've read this here, or I've read this there. Polymer chemists. We had people that we talked to in different industries. So the data is out there, and getting that full picture of the information, getting that full picture really does help to try to understand things.
There you go. We got a smart listening audience for sure.
Agreed.
Well, I hope we can gather some more stuff to talk about and get together again before too long.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, James.
Thanks again to Paul. So what do you think? Have we exhausted the topic? Are there other things that you want Paul to look into? If there are, shoot me an email. You can send those along with brewing questions, show suggestions, or if you just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Our Basic Brewing growler bags are available in our shop. Protect your precious homebrew and craft beers. You take it from place to place. Check out our support link where you can throw a couple of bucks into the tip jar by subscribing financially to our podcasts. Be sure to check out our DVDs, Extract Brewing and Partial Mashing, Stepping into All Grain, Low-Tech Lagering and Decoction Mashing, and Introduction to Wine Kits. You can find them all on our site. We've got combo deals to save you a few bucks if you want to buy more than one DVD at a time, and you can check out our Basic Brewing shirts in the store too. Our logbooks are in the store as well. Keep track of up to 50 batches of beer. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com, and if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order them online in our online shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We greatly appreciate the support. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Fluid Master 400A Anti-Siphon Toilet Tank Fill Valve and Everything Variety Unique 35-Count Variety Pack Single Cup Portion Pack Sampler for Keurig K-Cup Brewers. Thanks again, everybody. And remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping. We greatly appreciate your support. Don't forget you can also join the American Homebrewers Association and subscribe to Brew Your Own magazine through the associate links on basicbrewing.com. That's all until next time. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. I'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.